thank you all for joining us for our part 2, the role of prosecutors. Sorry I couldn't join you last month. I was moving back to California. It's nice to see everyone wearing masks somewhere. In the South, it's a little bit different. But I'm happy to be here. Thank you for carrying the torch without me last month, Kate and Scott. I know that we really did try for this month to get some public defenders here to talk to you all, and it just didn't happen. So please accept our apologies and know that we've already reached out to multiple formerly incarcerated citizens for our section next month on actually inside the prison system. And I can guarantee you we will have some folks who are not us here to speak about the experience. Of course, this session is being recorded, but we won't record the group discussion. That's something that we're doing as part of the Shakespeare in Prisons conference. Next slide. This is us. I'm Melinda. You all know Scott and Kate. Kate is the brains behind this operation today, and we have very much taken her lead, so lots of credit to her for all of the research that went into today's presentation. Next slide, agenda. All right, we're going to start with a little introduction, hit the lesson for a while, and then do some discussion. I think we'll all stay in the same room since there's only a couple of us here today, and then we'll talk about next steps. As individuals, we agree to respect confidentiality, speak from our own experience, stay engaged, listen to one another, keep our video on as much as possible, get comfortable being uncomfortable, monitor our own participation. Everyone here is great at that. None of us are experts. Be open, avoid judgment, have empathy for ourselves and for others. Sometimes we say stupid shit. Focus on whiteness as a racial category. Encourage contributions from everyone. Speak up if you feel like somebody's being excluded or if we missed a hand raise or something like that. Just drop it in the chat or say, hey, somebody wanted to say something. Accept and accept non-closure. Racial understanding wants ongoing dialogue. Again, I'm just going to blow through these really fast. I know you've heard them every month. Thank you so much for coming here and setting the intention to dismantling white supremacy within our society, within our programs, within our university departments, and our theater companies, and within ourselves. We know that we are not going to solve this in an hour. We will develop an anti-racist practice, just as we have a practice around meditation or going to the gym, because lives literally depend on it. And finally, we come together with the intention of acknowledging that we're not going to get a cookie for just showing up to do the work of racial justice. Although virtual hugs to everyone who's here today.
I send cookies to everyone.
Virtual cookies. Next slide. We've been over this, of course, but we're going to cover land acknowledgements at the top for anybody who maybe has missed that section or is unfamiliar to the concept of a land acknowledgement, which is a formal statement often spoken at the beginning of a public event that is taking place on land originally inhabited by or belonging to Indigenous people, which is everywhere. Structure for mass incarceration series. We've covered this a little bit in the past. We are right in January. February, we're going to discuss the prison system. March, the reentry system. And April, we're going to touch on the role of environmental justice. Again, we will try to have guests for every single one of these so that it's not just us yammering on and on. Next slide. Oh, this is our homework for
today.
For today, right. These links are embedded, and so we'll drop the presentation into the chat so that you can click on them and you don't have to search yourself. We've got a New York Times article detailing why Black folks are charged at higher rates than whites, and that's a really bulky piece. There's so much to chew on in there. I loved it. Unjust burden, the disparate treatment of Black Americans in the criminal justice system. Vera Institute, another great piece. They do a lot of great work. Next slide. I think I'll pass it off on this one. Yeah, I'm going to pass it off to my very worthy teammate, Kate Powers. Kate?
Oh, I was like, no, Scott, give it to Scott.
Hot potato to Scott.
We're learning to practice openness and transparency. We're trying to steal a few pages from the Sojourn Theater folks on that. So we're going to talk today about, as our conversation about sort of racism and policing last month was kind of scraping the surface, right? And we all sort of acknowledged that there was basically a semester's worth of content that we could have spent our time on around that issue. We're, of course, only touching on a few issues here, right? But hopefully then in our, if you want to learn more kind of scaffolded set of resources at the end, if there's something that you're curious about, you can dig deeper. Yeah, so what we're going to touch on today is cash bail as a concept, prosecutorial discretion, prosecutorial bias, and the bullet that we totally forgot to offer is the what are we all going to do about it part, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And apparently the first thing we're going to do is show up, so yay. Scott, do you want to just read that?
I think I can handle that. Thank you, Kate. So remember, the criminal justice system, black codes, penitentiary labor, convict leasing, lynchings, that was created after the Civil War to reassert white control over African-American bodies continues to exist today.
Thank you. Will you take the next one too? And then I'll.
Yeah. Racial disparities in the criminal justice system are no accident, but rather are rooted in a history of oppression and discriminatory decision-making that have deliberately targeted Black people and helped create an inaccurate picture of crime that deceptively links them with criminality.
Great. And that's from that Vera Justice report.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I imagine these pieces of information are familiar to many of us in this room through our work. Right? Black men comprise 13% of the US population, but 35% of those who are incarcerated. 1 out of every 9 Black men between the ages of 20 and 34 is behind bars. And Black women comprise 44% of those who are incarcerated, but make up only 13% of the female US population. So we got an issue, right? So again, just touching on the surface of this, right? So just a few of the racial disparities in the system. We talked last time about the 1994 crime bill and the disparities between crack and powder cocaine, and how even when the Obama administration revisited some of those policies, we went from a 500 to 1 differential between crack and powder to an 18 to 1 in terms of how those possessions are punished, right? So it's better, but it's still really discriminatory. We talked about the over-policing of predominantly Black neighborhoods, which eats away at the trust between the community and the police. And then we're going to talk about cash bail and the fines and the fees. So cash bail, ta-da! Disproportionate numbers of people of color are detained pre-trial because they can't afford bail, and because judges tend to set higher bail for Black and Latinx defendants. So we have a couple different studies that we are showing you some data from here. One of the things that this study by the American Economic Review found in 2018 is that you are more likely to be convicted if you can't afford bail, and we'll get into that in a minute, why that's true. But also found out that being in jail while awaiting trial makes it more likely that 2 to 4 years after that initial arrest, you will be engaged in criminal behavior or unemployed, and that 3 to 4 years after trial, you might be less likely to be employed. We also see that poverty is punished by the bail system. A person charged with a crime who can't afford bail obviously has to stay in jail until their trial takes place, even for months or years. African Americans here are disproportionately affected. An unfortunate poster child for this, right, is Khalif Browder, an African American teenager in the Bronx who was arrested for apparently the crime of stealing a backpack from somebody, and he could not afford the bail, and he was held at Rikers for over 2 years. At least 2 years. It may have been longer. I apologize. I should have double checked my number on that. But what Khalif Browder endured while he was incarcerated at Rikers, without having been sentenced to anything, right? But serving basically 2 years in this really difficult environment. He was abused. He was sent to solitary a lot. And he was so traumatized by his experience at Rikers that after he came home, when the charges for stealing the backpack, by the way, were dropped completely, he ended up taking his own life, right? So cash bail obviously favors people who have more money, who can pay and go home. It also makes it more likely that people will plead guilty just to get out of jail. And once you've pled guilty, of course, then if somebody else who's maybe an accomplice or who's charged with you is able to get a plea deal, you're serving that whole sentence because you've pled guilty in exchange for whatever the plea deal was, right? Cash bail has been eliminated or restricted in California, New Jersey, and Arizona. New York is experimenting with it, but they implemented some laws last year, and then there was this immediate kind of reactionary incendiary response, right? And so Andrew Cuomo kind of walked it back a little bit. So it's very much in flux what's going to happen in New York State. Here's just some data from the Prison Policy Initiative on the next slide. So in urban areas, Black felony defendants are over 25% more likely than white defendants to be held pre-trial. Illinois has eliminated cash bail too. Yay! That's excellent news, Karen and Alex. Across the country, Black and brown defendants are at least 10% up to 25% more likely than white defendants to be detained pre-trial. And young Black men are about 50% more likely to be detained pre-trial than white defendants. And also the Black and brown defendants tend to receive bail amounts that are twice as high as those that are set for white defendants. And of course, they're less likely in general to be able to afford that. So that's just sort of cash bail, right? And then there's fines and fees. Want to go to the next slide, please, Scott? So Michelle Alexander gives a really good example of this in the new Jim Crow. So I'm just going to read this little chunk to you about some of these examples of the fees and so on, right? So she says, imagine you are Emma Faye Stewart, a 30-year-old single African-American mother of two who was arrested as part of a drug sweep in Hearne, Texas. All but one of the people arrested were African-American. You're innocent. After a week in jail, you have no one to care for your two small children. You're eager to get home. Your court-appointed attorney urges you to plead guilty to a drug distribution charge, saying the prosecutor has offered probation. You refuse, steadfastly proclaiming your innocence. Finally, after almost a month in jail, you decide to plead guilty so that you can return home to your children. Unwilling to risk a trial and years of imprisonment, you are sentenced to 10 years probation and ordered to pay $1,000 in fines, as well as court and probation costs. You are also now branded a drug felon. You're no longer eligible for food stamps. You may be discriminated against in employment. You cannot vote for at least 12 years. And you are about to be evicted from public housing. Once homeless, your children will be taken from you and put into foster care. A judge eventually dismisses all the cases against the defendants who did not plead guilty. At trial, the judge finds that the entire sweep was based on the testimony of a single informant who lied to the prosecution. You, however, are still a drug felon, homeless, and desperate to regain custody of your children. We saw also in Ferguson, I don't know if you recall, right, that part of how the Ferguson police force was operating prior to the murder of Michael Brown was that they were using all kinds of traffic stops and police stops to generate income for the police department and for the court system, right? So you've obviously got a conflict of interest and kind of a two-tiered criminal justice system if part of the goal is to issue enough summonses and issue enough fines just to keep yourself sustainable, right? Then you're looking to drum up, right? So a vast majority of the low-level fines are traffic citations, so that's speeding or parking tickets. Those fines are quote unquote intended to deter crime, punish offenders, and compensate victims for losses. So if anybody on the call could explain to me who the victim is of a broken tail light, speak right up. I would love to learn. So these are really what's called poverty penalties. And then what happens, right, is a poor person who gets pulled over and is given this fine and they can't afford to pay it, then there are additional fines that get stacked on top of it because they are late or they are delinquent in paying it, and then they mount up, right? So part of what's happening is that some municipalities that are doing this are in effect discounting the concerns about any commitment to a principle of fundamental fairness in exchange for keep financing themselves. Does that make sense? Am I saying that relatively clearly? Okay, I see eyebrows coming up in a encouraging way. So some state legislatures are not funding their courts properly, and so the courts have to bring in the revenue through their operating budgets, and this undermines people's faith in the public justice system, right? If we didn't have enough other reasons to be a little suspicious. A 2017 survey found that 60% of Americans do not have enough money in savings to cover a $500 emergency. I imagine many of us have heard this particular statistic before, right? So if you can't afford to pay for a citation, the consequences of being in debt can impact your credit score. Eventually, maybe your driver's license gets taken away because you haven't paid these fines that are stacking up, right? And then you can't get to your job, which was the only place that you were earning income in order to try to pay these fines, right? And then you might end up being incarcerated. Now you're in jail because you haven't paid these fines, and now there's bail that you can't pay, because if you had the money, you would have just paid the fines in the first place. Yeah. So it becomes a kind of debtor's prison. Yeah. The impact of these kinds of practices are overwhelmingly and disproportionately borne by communities of color and the poor. Municipalities that rely heavily on revenue from fines and fees have a higher than average percentage of Black and brown folks relative to the demographics of the median. And another study found that residents living in the poorest zip codes of a city account for the vast majority of traffic infractions. The residents living in those zip codes were, you guessed it, disproportionately Black and brown folks.
So, prosecutors are uniquely situated to stem the tide of mass incarceration and to ensure that justice and fairness are more than lofty ideals for victims, those accused, and the communities they serve.
So prosecutors are not required by law to justify their decisions to the courts or to the public. Offices very rarely release information or even gather data about the choices that local prosecutors make. Much of what prosecutors do, and a lot of what they don't do, remains behind closed doors. So prosecutorial discretion, there's a little warm-up phrase for you, right? Prosecutorial discretion. So they play this huge role, right? They, by defending, by enabling and building upon police officers' behavior, they are perpetuating structural racism, right? They hold almost all of the power when it comes to plea bargaining or piling on charges. So public defender Rachel Kickerell in July wrote in the Washington Post in an op-ed, she said, criminal defendants, disproportionately Black, aren't evaluated as people with futures at stake. They're interchangeable chess pieces in a game that encourages hiding facts, overcharging in order to coerce pleas, and winning at all costs. So police make the arrest, but it's up to the prosecutor to make the decision about whether to charge somebody. And you could charge a young Black man with aggravated assault, or you could send him home with a swollen wrist and a bruised ego and a warning, right? That's an option that a prosecutor has, right? It's prosecutors who pursue pretrial detention without closely watching surveillance footage. It's prosecutors who call a man a danger to society, even though maybe he's also a youth mentor and a nonprofit employee and a community volunteer. And it's prosecutors who force him to either risk 60 months in jail if convicted, or plead guilty to a lesser felony that may yield probation, but also guarantee that he has a criminal record for life. The fact that African Americans are incarcerated at nearly 6 times the rate of white people is at least in part the result of discretionary decisions that are made by prosecutors behind closed doors.
94% of felony convictions are the result of a plea deal. a practice in which the prosecutor largely controls the charges offered, the sentence length, and the type of sentence and any conditions of community supervision.
Thank you. So a central claim that a lot of critics of mandatory sentencing make is that restricting judicial discretion further empowers prosecutors, who tend to exercise that power in ways that perpetuate or worsen disparities. The research, Melinda, shows that after controlling for the arrest, offense, and the criminal history and any other characteristics, there remains a black-white sentence length gap of more than 10%. Judges' choices do not appear to be principally responsible for this, according to an article that I read in the Yale Law Journal. I didn't know I was going to be reading articles in the Yale Law Journal when we started on this process. Between half and the entire gap is explained by prosecutors' initial charging decisions, right? Specifically, the decision about whether to bring a charge that carries a mandatory minimum or not. After controlling for pre-charge case characteristics, prosecutors in the sample of this Yale study were twice as likely to bring a charge that has a mandatory minimum attached to it against Black defendants. Next slide. So among otherwise similar cases and similar charges, the sentencing gap for Black and white defendants, 23.3%. Just sit with that number for a minute, right?
Hey, so that means that if a white defendant was sentenced to 10 years, that a Black defendant would be sentenced to 23.3 years? Something like that? Or did I do that wrong?
Yeah,
That's why I'm asking the question.
No, that's a good question. So what that means is if the charges are similar, the odds of the Black person being convicted and sent to prison while the white person maybe has community service or probation, the difference is 20, almost a quarter of the time, right? More than 23% of the time, the Black person is convicted and the white person walks with a warning or a probation or whatever it might be. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a riveting article in the Yale Law Journal called Mandatory Sentencing and Racial Disparity, which I can share the link to if anybody really wants to get into the weeds on this one. So next slide, if you would. It has a lot of words on it. I'm really sorry. While a Black-white gap appears to be introduced during the criminal justice process, it appears to stem largely from prosecutors' charging choices, right? So Vera Institute concluded that prosecutors were 143% more likely to bring first-degree murder charges against Black defendants with white victims than any other racial combination, right? So if a white person kills a white person or a Black person kills a Black person, the likelihood of that being sort of negotiated down to negligent homicide or second degree or third degree, right, is much higher. But if it's a Black defendant and a white victim, right, and we've talked about this in the context of all the accusations that led to lynching in the late 19th century, right, that the most surefire way for that to happen was for a white woman to accuse a Black man of something, right? So it's still here, right? It's traced right through. Prosecutors 143% more likely. Next slide, if you would, Scott. So, and when the defendant's a police officer, prosecutors, as we have seen, are much more reluctant or unwilling to do their jobs. In, Minnesota last June, right? Mike Freeman, the Hennepin County District Attorney, was loath to bring charges against the officers in the murder of George Floyd. And fortunately, the state attorney general, Keith Ellison, sort of took over the case, right? Which is why we got charges as quickly as we did there. And so we have a few examples here. Eric Garner was killed by Officer Daniel Pantaleo, and it took several years before a grand jury in Staten Island declined to press any charges against Daniel Pantaleo. Mike Brown was killed by Officer Darren Wilson. Laquan McDonald was shot 16 times by Officer Jason Van Dyke in Chicago. And Tamir Rice was shot within 2 seconds of Officer Timothy Loman's arrival at the park where he was playing with a toy, right? Chicago prosecutor Anita Alvarez waited almost a year before indicting the officer who killed Laquan McDonald. She only did it after the videotape of the killing was released, right? The Chicago officer who killed Reka Boyd was acquitted after a botched prosecution by one of Alvarez's attorneys, right? So it's entirely possible, we don't know exactly what happened in that prosecutor's office, right? But perhaps it wasn't really a priority to do everything they could to win that case. So the prosecutor in the Tamir Rice case oversaw a grand jury investigation that involved leaked expert reports justifying the shooting, presentation of evidence that Tamir kept a toy gun longer than he should have, and accusations that Tamir's family protested the killing of their son because they thought they could get a payoff. So that's part of what they told the grand jury in that case. So a little good news on the next slide. Whew. Right. San Francisco is really trying to look at this. And so they have started to send to the district attorney's office a kind of a report where some of this information is hidden from them, right? So they're having to make a charging decision without knowing the name, the ethnicity, or some of the or the zip code that's the defendant is from, right? So it's only after they make preliminary decision about charging that they're permitted to see the other information, including race, right? And at that point, then they can also see body camera footage. Regardless of the initial charging determination, all of the evidence ultimately gets reviewed by other attorneys in the office in San Francisco. And prosecutors are also in San Francisco now required to explain, you know, if they change their mind once this is unblinded and they see race and zip code, and then they decide actually they want to add more charges, they have to explain to a circle of peers what changed their mind, right? So that they can track that. So tiny little.
And do we know the efficacy of this? Like, has it been in place long enough for us to see results?
It's pretty new. I think they only started doing this in 2019. And of course, the last year is such an outlier by every imaginable metric, right?
Sure.
So we can all keep an eye on them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So is this?
I mean, I'm pretty sure I know what the results are going to say. I just want to see them, you know?
So your prosecutor represents you, right? So here's a place where we can all enter into this. And for once, it's not just us saying, here's where you can donate, right? Because theater people and people who work in prison are a great place to raise money. So there's a whole bunch of questions that we can be asking, right? Because we vote these people into office, and often, you know, they're down the ballot a little bit and you kind of go, oh, well, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. But perhaps I will say I have not always been very diligent about researching who the candidates were for this role, right? I know I myself could certainly be more diligent about this. And one of the things I found is this amazing resource on the next couple slides with some real hard questions that you can start to ask about candidates who are running for this office. Or, you know, if there's a prosecutor in your community who, you know, runs unopposed, you still have a whole bunch of questions you can be asking. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The Vera Institute has this list of key questions for community members, right? And they break them up into 7 different categories. After an arrest, the police present the case to the prosecutor, who decides whether to prosecute the individual and what charges to bring, right? The charging decision affects every subsequent decision in that individual's case, including the amount of bail, whether or not a plea deal might be offered, the length and type of any ultimate sentence, including whether the sentence triggers immigration consequences, like, say, deportation, right? So around charging, you can ask, what are the guidelines that inform charging decisions? You know, they don't disclose that information in most prosecutors' offices. Again, in San Francisco and now in Philadelphia, we're starting to see some district attorneys who are a little more progressive in their thinking and who are starting to be a little more transparent about these things. But those are still the outlier rather than the rule. So we can just call and ask, what are the guidelines, right? Around bail, what guidelines or training do prosecutors receive that inform their bail recommendations? Because they go in, I mean, this part from Law and Order, when you see them say, we're asking for $1 million, right? And then the judge says, so ordered, or the defense attorney says, no, because he's not a flight risk and whatever, right? There's some truth to that. So does the office ever recommend release? If so, how often? What kind of cases, right? Diversion, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about diversion in a minute, but diversion basically means, what if we didn't charge this person? What if we redirected them into something that's not going to end up in a criminal conviction for them, right? Like a community service program or some kind of training program or nonviolent alternatives to violence program in the community, right? So what happens to the cases of individuals who maybe complete a diversion program? Do the charges against them get dropped? Does the office offer any diversion programs, right? Then discovery, right? That's the production of documents around someone's case, right? So when does the prosecutor's office share whatever it's found with the defense? Because if they don't share it with them until the day before trial, an overworked public defender might not be able to do anything with that information, right? Next slide, please. Case processing. What now? Right? Case processing says the Sixth Amendment guarantees our right to a speedy trial. Ha ha ha. Right? Prosecutors play a huge role in ensuring that this right is upheld. But as we all know, if any of you have ever had any negotiation, like I went to housing court several years ago because of an issue with a landlord, and it took a year. Housing court, landlord, right? So although many states have speedy trial statutes that recommend a specific time frame for charges to be filed and for the case to go to trial, these aren't binding. And in practice, it can take months or even years for a case to reach a resolution, right? So we can be asking, like, what's the policy in our local public defenders, or excuse me, in our local district attorney's office? What's the policy around the speedy trial guidelines? Pleas, right? And we can ask also, what's the average time that it takes for a misdemeanor case to be resolved or a felony case to be resolved, right? Those are questions we can just ask. And they might be a little annoyed with us, but that's okay. Around plea bargaining, right? Again, what are the guidelines that inform bail recommendations? And the plea bargaining process is one of the places where the power of the prosecutor is most evident. The prosecutor controls, again, the charges, the length of the sentence, any conditions of community supervision. And the plea is the only way that many individuals can return home quickly if they're in jail on a bond that might take months or years to process. So let's find out about that, right? Is it being done consistently? Is it being done fairly? How often are plea offers made that are below the top charge on the case, right? What about a case would allow a prosecutor to come down from the highest possible charge? And then finally, sentencing, right? What are the guidelines that inform sentencing recommendations? If a person has been found or has pled guilty, usually the prosecutor then makes a recommendation to the judge, right? They have tremendous discretion unless they've charged something that has a mandatory minimum, yeah? They are uniquely positioned to influence judges to impose sentences that are fair and focused on addressing the needs of both the victim and the person convicted. Yeah. So those are all questions we can ask, and you can literally call up your district attorney and ask those questions, or you can go to their website and look for the answers to those questions and, you know, advocate for one candidate over another based on what you find, or make a righteously indignant noise if you're not getting the information you need. Yeah. So now we have another video about a diversion program in St. Louis. Can we hear?
We as prosecutors have to
Yeah, just jack up that volume on your end.
Incarceration. We've been tough on crime. What is our return?
People think of the police as the ones who bring people into the system. A lot of people don't recognize that prosecutors can stop criminal justice involvement at the moment of arrest. It is their decision and their decision alone, whether or not to charge someone, whether or not that case will move forward at all, or whether any system involvement can stop right there.
Going to jail, going to jail, going to jail. Getting out, going to jail, going to jail, going to jail. It's the same cycle. Eventually, if I'm constantly going to jail, my son gonna go to jail.
We can't arrest our way out of the problem. We're not going to incarcerate our way out of the problem. Those things have been shown to be ineffective, empirically. We know. You get discussions around criminal justice reform now, and they are bipartisan discussions. People on both sides of the aisle understand the system is broken. That's not even up for legitimate debate.
Defendants were once victims. It's a cycle. They need therapists. Like they need to sit down, talk to somebody because they've been through trauma. One way to break the cycle is just by getting them the help they need. Somebody does, community service. They take anger management class. They meet with a therapist. They do everything we ask. We dismiss a case. It's a full circle way to just give people a second chance.
Public safety is our first priority. We put resources in place for the people who get accepted into the program for them to be successful, whether that's employment. You need a GED. You may need some kind of counseling, drug counseling, anger management. There's any number of support resources we put in place for you to be successful.
What I do inside the diversion program is I actually show these kids to search for their why. So what we do is a constantly 24/7 mentoring service that I actually provide to go get them to be a better person. If I got resources to get them a job, I put them on the right track.
I was required to do community service and stay out of trouble. The whole thing is that they're giving me an extra chance and to change my future, and I shouldn't be doing anything to jeopardize that. You have to work for it. You got to pay attention. And that's what the program really instilled in me, to be responsible. I'm going to be helping out whatever I can. I just want that same opportunity for the next person. Just got to know that somebody cares and somebody want better for you. Just like I want better for my son or my siblings. Just makes me want to give back.
Right now, I'm currently a TIG welder. I went to school for it back then, but I got off track. The program motivated me to get back into that. I met Mr. Sid telling me like, man, the path you're going down, it ain't a good road, but I ain't want to listen. He helped me a lot, like understand a lot. Sometimes I ain't have gas. He'll come pick me up. I ain't think that, where I come from, somebody would do something like that for me.
The system is not serving not just those who are accused and brought into it, but victims who suffered harm and who need something better than what we offer to create safety and wholeness in ways that the system does not.
Kids do not belong in jail. They need to have a chance.
It's a program meant to give people a second chance. So if a person has a bad day, they don't necessarily get thrown away in jail for the rest of their life. And instead,
What's everybody thinking about all that? Or what questions do you have, or what do you want to do with all that?
I think you just did a really amazing job of explaining a very complex process in a way that was pedestrian enough for me to get it. So I really, really appreciate that, because I think we are, I'm with Melinda. I like data, I like metrics and things like that. And it's all about look at this incarceration rate versus this incarceration rate, these things. We start to get into process design, and it seems so out of our reach. And you just gave us some really achievable actions to hold these public servants accountable for systemic racist practice, because a lot of them probably aren't auditing it either. They're looking for convenience, and the more opaque the process is, the easier it is for them to just quote unquote do their job.